Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the September 6, 2023 meeting of the North Carolina State Board of Education. I'm Eric Davis, Chair of the Board, and I call this meeting to order. Delighted to welcome all board members, advisors, staff, on-site visitors, online listeners, and Twitter followers. Please note that you can follow the State Board of Education on its Twitter page at edstateboard_NC. You can also follow the meeting online and see all of our materials by going to SBE meetings at www.ncpublicschools.org. For our visitors and those listening online, today's agenda involves our board discussions on agenda items, and tomorrow's agenda is official meeting date when the board will vote on its action items. One morning recently, I crossed paths with a young mother, a bit exasperated, as she hurriedly led her kindergarten son to the bus stop. He had a book bag on his back and a piece of toast in his hand. And in between bites, he announced to me, "I'm going to school and I'm late for the bus stop." Well, we know that scene was repeated all over our state. And on behalf of the board, I'd like to extend our thanks to every parent and family member, including that young mother, who with so much love prepared their child, regardless of age, for the first day of school. It's our honor to be your partner in educating your child, which is the most important duty and opportunity our state has. In addition, I'd like to thank every district and school leader. Just a moment to address that. So I'd also like to thank every district and school leader who, despite not having a budget and receiving some additional administrative responsibilities at the last minute, rose to the occasion and created in nearly every school an effective climate of respect and trust, which our teachers certainly deserve, as well as a warm, welcoming environment for our students. And especially to our teachers and our bus drivers, and every member of our education team who rose above it all and with a generous spirit and a warm smile and open arms welcomed our students back to school just as they are. You're absolutely the best. And to our students, we are delighted to have you back in our schools. We're delighted to be in school with you, and we're all in for you. If you could join me in thanking our educators and welcoming our new students back to school. And speaking of thankfulness, I'm delighted to thank our local superintendents who are with us today and or tomorrow. We so appreciate your service and your leadership on the front lines educating our children. In addition to our Superintendent Advisor, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ethan Linker from Pitt County Schools, Dr. Cindy Bennett from Vance County Schools, Dr. Tony Jackson from Chatham County Schools, Dr. Dale Ellis from Montgomery County Schools, and Dr. Dan Brigman from Avery County Schools. Would you please stand so we could thank you? With all that you have going, we're honored that you'd spend a few minutes with us today and tomorrow, and thank you for your leadership. Board members, you're reminded that it's our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this board. Does any member of the board know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. Board members, you received the agenda last week and had the opportunity to review it. Ask if there are any requests for changes to the agenda. Hearing none,
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Treasurer.
Mr. Chairman, the State Treasurer Falwell, I'd like to have EICS2 removed from the agenda before the consent agenda is approved. And I make that motion.
Okay, there's a motion before us to remove EICS2 from our agenda. Is there a second?
Olivia Oxendine seconds the motion.
Okay, is there any discussion on the motion? Okay, Dr. Petrie-Martin, will you call the roll to capture the vote?
Dr. Oxendine.
Yes.
Ms. Kamnitz?
No.
Mr. Keenan?
No.
Mr. Hull?
No.
Dr. Tipton Rogers?
No.
Mr. Blackburn?
No.
Dr. Ford? Treasurer Falwell?
Yes, to remove the agenda item.
Lieutenant Governor Robinson? Vice Chair Duncan?
No.
Chair Davis?
No. Motion fails 5-2. Back before us is the agenda as presented. Is there a motion to approve the agenda as presented? Motion by Mr. Hall, second by Ms. Kamnitz. Dr. Petrie Morton.
Dr. Oxendine?
No.
Ms. Kamnitz?
Yes.
Mr. Keenan?
Yes.
Mr. Hull?
Yes.
Dr. Tipton Rogers?
Yes.
Mr. Blackburn?
Yes.
Dr. Ford? Treasurer Falwell?
No.
Lieutenant Governor Robinson? Vice Chair Duncan?
Yes.
Chair Davis?
Yes, that motion carries 7-2. Thank you. We now have an agenda. We'll now proceed to our Student Learning and Achievement Committee led by Ms. Jill Kamnitz. Ms. Kamnitz.
Thank you, Chair Davis. I share the work of this committee with my colleague, Dr. Olivia Oxendine. And we have a very full agenda this morning, some anxiously awaited data, but before we get there, we'll start with our new business and Dr. Day, our standards updates, of which there are quite a few going on right now, as we all know. So, Dr. Day, if you'll start us off.
Thank you. Good morning. We come to you this morning bringing updates on our standards review process. First, we'll start with our state board policy. This is the policy that guides our work, SCOS 012, so just a reminder of that policy. And then our internal procedures manual, this is what lays out our process. So you'll see on pages 17 through 23, that's where you'll find details on where we are across all of our areas at this point, which are in review and revision. We'll start with updates with Healthful Living. We are still in process. The stakeholder and PSU survey was released June 5th, and that was on the first draft. These surveys closed this month on September 18th. Once that happens, the data will be given to OLR, the Office of Learning Recovery, to be analyzed and organized. And then we start our cycle all over again with the DRC and the SWT coming together to create a draft 2. And as a reminder, we work to get 3 drafts. So right now we have a first draft out, then we'll have a second draft this winter, and then our goal is to tentatively come spring, late spring, with a draft 3 to the board. Next, we have guidance. Guidance looks a little different. We sent out a survey regarding the ASCA, the American School Counselor Association, Student Mindsets and Behaviors. The DRC saw a trend within their data that many would like to adopt these mindsets and behaviors as the standard course of study. So in order to get a pulse on the field on their thoughts on that, we released an additional survey, and that will be closed on September 10th. Once that happens, OLR will take the data, organize and analyze, and then the DRC will come back together, take a look at that data, and create a report based on that survey data. Next, we have arts. Arts, we had permission to revise in June, so the writing team was selected, and they worked since the week of July 17th, and they are currently wrapping up their draft 1. Tentatively, we hope to bring draft 1 of all 4 of the arts areas to the board in October. And once we do that, we will release a survey on that first draft to collect additional feedback. Next, we have world languages. We are happy to hit the milestone of draft 1 being complete. We will go through a couple slides here in a moment and have some guests with us to talk about that process. After the board meeting this week, we will send out a survey for feedback on that first draft. So that will go out in mid-September and stay open at least 30 days. And once that closes, the feedback will be organized and analyzed, and the DRC will come back together to create their report, which will then be given over to the writers, and they will work on draft 2. Hey, as a reminder for world languages, we came before the board in June to ask permission to revise, and we brought a lot of this data to you. As a reminder, the DRC report is based on research. So during the review phase, a lot of research is conducted across other states, national research, national standards, legislation, policies. So that occurred during review. Focus groups and interviews took place. And then this DRC report was created by the Data Review Committee. It has two main sections. One shows the data, the qualitative and the quantitative, and then the DRC came to conclusions and recommendations based on that data. Also, during that very first survey, the one that went out on the current standard course of study, we received 84.3% LEA response, which is fairly high. Response rate. We also had over 1,100 all stakeholder responses and 142 focus group participants and interviewees. So that DRC report was based on a lot of qualitative and quantitative data. So with that, I'd like to introduce our two guests that we have with us today. Representing the DRC, the Data Review Committee, we have Dr. Tracy Wade. She is Director of Secondary Instruction and the Title III Coordinator in the Mooresville Graded School District. She's a former world language teacher and department chair. Representing the SWT, the Standards Writing Team, we have Mr. Keegan Storrs, lead world language teacher at Roxborough Community School, and also the 2022 North Carolina Charter School Teacher of the Year. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Wade.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to share with you this morning some of the findings and process for the DRC. We work together in diverse groups to analyze the survey and focus group data that Ms. Day mentioned, and we examine that data through each strand. World languages is a little different because our strands represent proficiency levels rather than courses. Those strands are based not only in reading, writing, listening, and speaking, but also in what we call 4 Cs, which you'll hear a little bit more about on a future slide. So we did identify through that data analysis those standards that were most in need of revision, and then we looked at those open-ended responses from the focus groups and the interviews to kind of determine why those stakeholders felt like revision or changes were needed. After reviewing that data, the team then reviewed the research, as mentioned, from the field and standards from other states and national organizations to determine how North Carolina could be a leader and continue to lead in world language instruction, as we were one of the first states to move to a proficiency-based standard system. Each proficiency level subgroup prepared recommendations for this report based on those trends and that research to be able to justify the recommendations we were making to the standards writing team. Each recommendation in that report is based on a justification from both that stakeholder input and the supporting research. This spreadsheet on the next slide will show how we went through by each standard for each proficiency level to recommend whether there should be minor revisions, major revisions, or whether we were recommending a standard for removal. The role of our DRC was, again, not to begin the revision process, but rather to provide that rationale and research to support the recommendations that were turned over to the standards writing team. There are 3 points that we want to highlight from the DRC report. The first was that the use of the ACTFL World Readiness Standards for Learning Languages and the necessful ACTFL Can-Do statements should be the framework and the taxonomy for the new North Carolina standards. These came out after our initial first draft of our currently adopted North Carolina standards and are very well aligned with what we've been teaching, but are much more streamlined. They are based on that professional research from these larger groups. The NACESFL group is the National Council of State Supervisors for Language, and these standards bring together our 4 Cs that I mentioned: communication, connection, comparison, and being part of a global community. These can-do statements then further clarify the level of learning that students and educators need to reach in each of these proficiency levels, since we are, again, proficiency-based and not course-based. That led to recommendation 2, which is that by having clarity in our standards and fewer standards, we will be able to raise the rigor for those courses, to increase the expectations for what students would be able to say, do, and know related to the language that they are studying. Pardon me. And finally, we asked, the DRC asked the standards writing team to consider clarifying wording or objectives. In many cases, we felt like the language may have been deficit-based or had some bias in it, or was not inclusive of all languages. For example, references to spoken or signed language and representation of the 18 languages that are taught in North Carolina, including American Sign Language. Based on those recommendations, we were then able to provide the standards writing team with that full report as well as the standard by standard spreadsheet. And so now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Keegan, who's going to share with you the standard writing team process.
Good morning. Thanks for having us this morning. I was very excited to begin our work with the standards writing team this past July and to act, although very quickly, on the recommendations from the Data Review Committee that Tracy just mentioned. Besides engaging in whole group discussion, our standards writing team divided and conquered by grouping ourselves by proficiency level and also by program type. Our NC World Language Standards are currently broken up into 3 major proficiency bands: novice, intermediate, and advanced, and into 8 sublevels: novice low, novice mid, novice high, intermediate low, mid, and high, and advanced low and mid. One of the most straightforward changes that we made is to add an advanced high proficiency level as we seek to increase the rigor of our language courses in North Carolina. This also better aligns us with the American Council for the Teaching of Foreign Languages, the ACTFL guidelines, which is essentially the U.S. national standard for foreign language and world language education. In addition to re-examining the objectives at each proficiency level, we also focused on the 3 main types of language programs offered in North Carolina schools: modern language programs like your traditional French, Spanish, Mandarin courses, classical language programs like Latin and Ancient Greek, and dual language immersion and heritage programs, like programs where students spend at least 50% of the day immersed in a world language other than English. We spoke at length about how to ensure that our new standards are inclusive enough to address the needs of each of these program types, while also being specific enough to assist teachers as they create developmentally appropriate learning goals, activities, and assessments for their students. Importantly, these standards are proficiency-based, meaning that the standards, strands, and objectives will target specific skills rather than specific content areas. And we worked with these standards and objectives relying heavily on the ACTFL NACESL standards, which are essentially an industry standard for U.S. teachers working in world language education, and was also a recommendation by the DRC committee. Importantly, our team put a lot of emphasis on streamlining the standards and objectives in order to be as economical as possible, but without losing any of the essential elements of a well-designed language course. First, we reduced the number of standards from 4 to 3, eliminating the 4th standard, which is compare the student's culture and the target culture. This does not mean that we removed cultural comparison and interculturality from the objectives. On the contrary, our team noted that many of the redundancies in the current standards came from places where the standards and strands overlapped in scope. So while we eliminated cultural comparison as a standard, we preserved this essential skill in the new intercultural connections strand. In addition to decreasing the number of standards from 4 to 3, we also reduced the number of strands from 3 to 2, combining the connections to language and literacy strand with the connections to other disciplines strand into a new literacy and interdisciplinary connection strand that sits alongside our intercultural connections strand. Therefore, instead of interweaving 4 standards and 3 strands for a total of 12 intersections, we were able to interweave 3 standards and 2 strands for a total of 6. This is what helped our team reduce the number of objectives overall. For example, the novice low proficiency level now contains just 14 discrete objectives, as opposed to a total of 34 in the current world language standards. And that would be 34, it's compared to 14, spread out over all 8, now 9 proficiency levels. So drastically reducing the number of objectives and streamlining it for teachers. To illustrate how we did this, I'll quickly mention just a few of the objectives from the current World Language Standards document. These are 3 different objectives that teachers are expected to teach to right now in North Carolina. 1, create presentations on a variety of topics that are comprehensible to specified audiences. 2, use language to modify presentations about academic content areas for some specific audiences. And 3, use the language to share information about a variety of topics with some specific audiences. With this current verbiage, many teachers, administrators, and other stakeholders may struggle to identify which of these objectives a given lesson or assessment is actually targeting. We were very intentional in this new draft to cut back on some of this overlap So now we have one objective that simply reads, state a viewpoint with supporting evidence on some concrete topics of interest by producing paragraphs and using time shifts. This objective is clearly differentiable from other objectives in the same proficiency band, such as tell stories about familiar experiences and events by producing paragraphs and using time frame shifts. On the last slide, for us, this slide right here, I'll just briefly highlight the succinct nature of this new draft for the World Language Standards. It includes specific and measurable actions. For example, use probing questions, provide detailed responses, interact to resolve a complication, maintain extended conversations, etc., with minimal amounts of repetition throughout standards and objectives. Overall, I think our team's come together to produce a first draft that we're incredibly proud of, and we're very excited to gather stakeholder feedback that the DRC will analyze and that we will incorporate as we create future drafts 2 and 3 of these new World Language Standards. Thank you so much for your time and attention this morning. I would love to open the floor for any questions for myself or other members of our team.
Any questions? Dr.
Just a very quick question. I think one of you answered the question I had jotted down in my notes about the number of the variety of languages taught in our public schools, and I think the answer is 18.
Yes, ma'am, I believe that's correct.
So
Yes.
within that number, would we find the language of the Eastern Band Cherokee?
I believe that's correct. Yes, Cherokee is one of those 18.
Okay, that is good. Thank
Yes.
you. That is very
And
good.
our team actually was on campus at the Cherokee School recently and saw that that's very alive and well on that campus right now.
Very, very much so. I'm just so happy to hear that. And I hope my Cherokee friends are listening.
Any other? Yes, Ms. Carter.
Excellent job, Keegan. Very proud of you. Quick question. You're changing, anytime teacher sees like, okay, our standards are changing, they get stressed out, worried that, my whole life is going to change. How will this benefit or change the lives of teachers to make things a little more simple?
Sure. As a teacher who teaches a lot of different proficiency levels right now, as well as dual language immersion, to me, these really streamline what we're doing in our classroom. We are not radically changing the expectations for what our students will be doing. We're just making it easier for teachers to identify and to target for their administrators and for other stakeholders what we're actually doing by reducing that total number of standards without really changing the goals of a language course. Yes, Superintendent.
Thank you. And to piggyback on Ms. Carper's comments and question, one of the criticisms of academic standards writ large in our nation is that they are a mile wide and an inch deep. And so that you are being intentional about streamlining those standards is a very positive step, and one that I hope teachers will see the value in, because having standards that are a mile wide and an inch deep doesn't serve teachers or students. So thank you for being intentional about that.
Absolutely. And just one more note on that. Because we're adding to the proficiency bands and adding advanced high, we are able to adjust expectations based on course for where our students will be based on the language that they're starting with. For most of our students, that's English, but that's not always the case. And based on the language that they're learning, whether that is a language more similar to English that uses the Roman alphabet, or a language like Mandarin, for example, that uses the logographic alphabet. And so by using these proficiency bands, we can really target where we would like our students to be and adapt what we're asking them to do at that level. So for a Spanish 1 class, for example, it might be respond with a single word to a familiar question. But for a Spanish 4 or AP class, we might expect an entire paragraph length response with shifts in time, and we might expect them to respond to unfamiliar stimuli as well. So yeah, we're keeping it general enough that it applies to everybody, but specific enough where teachers really know what's expected of them within each proficiency band of language.
Merci.
It strikes me that because this is a proficiency-based, these are proficiency-based standards, it really does let you get the depth.
Yes.
That maybe is more difficult for other academic areas.
Yes, ma'am.
Any other questions? As always, we appreciate so much hearing from the people who are doing this work. Every month we've been there's a lot of standards work going on right now, and we've been hearing the report every month. So you and Dr. Wade making this really real for us and helping us understand the work that goes into this. We very much appreciate it, so thank you for coming.
Thank you all so much.
We have one other item of new business, which is going to be the beginning of the Dr. Howard show this morning. So an update on the North Carolina Personalized Assessment Tool, affectionately known as NCPAT or NCPAT. I'm not sure how we pronounce that, but you will explain it to us, Dr. Howard.
Absolutely, and thank you and good morning. So we are providing an update today on what is referred to as the North Carolina Personalized Assessment Tool, NCPAT. And you'll remember, because we've come to this board several times over the past 4 years and talking about in 2019, the U.S. Department of Education granted North Carolina an assessment demonstration authority. That did not come with any funding. That came with the permission to develop an end-of-grade assessment that is comparable to the current end-of-grade assessment. And that is something you'll hear me say a couple of times, because it's very important that we take away that this is not about changing expectations or standards. This is about developing an assessment that assesses those students in a different way, but with the same expectation, and that is actually required in federal law. At the same time that we were given this authority from the U.S. Department of Education, the North Carolina General Assembly, through Senate Bill 621, also affirmed its intention for North Carolina to move to a through-grade assessment model. So a through-grade assessment model is one where assessments are administered throughout the school year rather than one single testing event, which we have now with our end-of-course and our end-of-grade test. This model is being pursued by many states across our nation. I would dare say there are variability in those models and how they are constructed. This is North Carolina's approach to that model. And it is grounded in our work that began in 2015 on NC check-ins, which came about as input from the field through a task force on assessment that, again, wanted for us to pursue through grade assessment. And at that time, we said, well, let's take the first step and let's develop some through grade assessments, not for accountability, but for instructional purposes, and let's see where it takes us. So today, we're giving an update of where we are in the next steps. So in the chart that was on the previous slide, this kind of maps out, if you will, NC Check-ins 2.0, and what we are now going to talk primarily about today is a new look to the end-of-grade assessment. So grounded in the first column, you see instruction, because instruction always occurs before assessing. And the intention of the NC Check-ins 2.0 is to then have stopping points along the way where we assess students with the purpose of using that information to modify subsequent instruction. The strength of the NC Check-ins 2.0 is that teachers get to look at the actual assessment items. They get to look at the responses from the students, so they know which items a student got correct, which items a student did not get correct, and they can think about maybe the student's understanding of where they need to adjust that instruction. Back to that task force in 2015, it was said many times that our end-of-grade assessments, our end-of-course assessments, are autopsy data because, of course, once it's been reported out, then the school year is over and those students go on to other teachers. So NC Check-ins 2.0 is grounded in giving that through-grade benefit, but yet not putting it in accountability. But as we'll talk through today, we do have a connection with NC Check-ins 2.0 to that summative assessment, and that for students that do participate in NC Check-ins 2.0, we can take 2 of those test scores and we can use that information to more appropriately assign a test form to them. So on the chart in the PowerPoint, it does show participation for NC Check-ins 2.0 for this previous school year. Now, these are not the students that were in the pilot. A subset of these students were in the pilot. And you can see this is for grades 3 through 8, reading and math, and it's right around 60,000, give or take a few thousand, depending upon the content and the subject. Also to note, we do have end-of-course NC check-ins as well, and NC check-ins for science, grades 5 and 8. And those have been added over the years because of demand from the field that found benefit in those first NC check-ins and said, okay, we want more. We want them at these other grade levels and content areas. So with that, we're going to shift to talking about the summative, because we've spent 4 years talking a lot about NC Check-ins 2.0. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about now where we're in year 5 and we're ready to implement, hopefully statewide, the new designed end-of-grade assessment. So one thing to remember about this very clearly, going back to the expectations, is this new design is the same as the current end of grade with respect to the test content blueprint, with respect to the standards, with respect to the test format, the number of items, the type of items, the scale scores, those academic achievement levels that this board approves. It has the same expectations for student performance. That is a very key point. On this map in North Carolina, you can see in 2022-23, we had 189 schools across 27 districts, 14 charter and lab schools, and Cherokee Central schools that participated in what we refer to as the pilot. And what that meant was instead of the current end of grade, those students took this multi-stage adaptive end of grade assessment. So one thing to go back and think about is really how is this different than what we are currently doing. So since the 1990s, we have typically had 3 test forms for any given grade and content area. If we were a classroom, we would what we call randomly spiral those forms in this classroom. A third of us would get Form A, a third of us would get Form B, a third of us would get Form C. The shift here is instead of randomly assigning those forms, we're going to use information from the NC Check-ins 2.0 for those students that have those scores. It's not required. That part is not required. So it'll be a local decision as to whether or not they participate in that. But for those students who do have that, they will get a form assigned to them that is more reflective of their previous performance with the NC Check-ins 2.0. And we might ask ourselves, well, why would we even want to do that? So what are the key advantages of doing this? For one, we're going to increase the breadth and depth of the items administered on the EOG without adding to the number of items that a student takes. And what that does psychometrically, and of course this is led by our senior psychometrician, Dr. King Bavella, what that does is that gives strength across the scale. And I'm going to show you that in a moment. So you'll be able to see how it's going to add strength to that scale. It's going to improve the testing experience for students. I've heard many times that sometimes our students, they get that test form, they read the first 2 or 3 items, they're totally discouraged, they put their head down on the desk. And so that testing experience, which is a lot of feedback that we get throughout the course of the year, part of that will be addressed in this. Because for those students who may not have done as well, they will get some items that maybe are more in line to their performance level. Now, they still have the potential to score a level 5. Just like those students who did really well are going to still have the potential to not be proficient. Okay? So it's going to run the gamut, and you'll see that in a moment. But the key thing to take away is this model, even though a lot of our focus and conversation is about that end of grade multi-stage adaptive, and that's very exciting, right? But the real excitement here is on the through grade opportunity with the NC Check-ins 2.0. Now, we would be first to say administering NC Check-ins 2.0 in and of itself will not glean increased student achievement. What increases student achievement, and I'm sure my colleagues to the right can attest to this, is instruction and the content standards. And what we're trying to do is give information through the year so we have a balanced assessment system. And at this point in our design, we still have that end of grade assessment. We're just trying to make it more appropriate. So on the next slide, you'll be able to see the actual curves, if you will. So the middle curves, which are in blue, is the current end of grade assessment. And then if you see, we have those yellow circles to the left and we have the green circles to the right. That is where we're adding items to the scale. Some students will be directed to that form with the yellow circles. Some students will be directed to the green circles. Probably most students will still continue to be in the middle. And we have to have a system for any student that comes in on test day Because if I arrive in a public school on the first day of testing, I have to be given that test. And so we have to have a methodology that we can, in all fairness, give them an appropriate test form as well. So, and that also is why we don't have to have those 2 NC check-ins scores. But if you do, then you get this experience. The key takeaway that I'd like for us to remember on this is if you'll follow that yellow line on the left, and you see how that curve goes up, and then it goes all the way over to level 5. And that is the evidence that you can perform the continuum of the academic achievement levels on that form. You are not limited to your performance. And likewise, as I said before, if you follow the green line, you'll see the students can also demonstrate across the continuum of those. So in this work over the years, we have had to really make sure we do one thing that's critical, and that is listen to our stakeholders across the state. And we've spent a lot of time, we've been supported by the Friday Institute for Educational Innovation. They have done surveys, they have done focus groups. Our team has done an excellent job in going out and doing monitoring and visits with schools to get a better understanding of what works and what doesn't work. And so we've made vast improvements over the past 4 years in doing that, and we will continue to do that, and we have plans for that for 2023-24. We also have partnered with the National Center for Improvement of Educational Assessment. They're an external evaluator of this whole process. They have reports that are being finalized now that you will be able to have access to when you come back for your October meeting. So those reports and that input from an external person looking in saying, well, you might be able to do this a little bit better has been very helpful. And then the other partners that we have had that cannot be underestimated is our partnership with the University of North Carolina at Greensboro Office of Assessment, Evaluation, and Research. Dr. Mabella works very closely with them and looking at this data, ensuring that we have comparability and reliability as required by federal law, and also to validate the form assignment methodology. So I can assure you that data has been gone through with a fine-tooth comb to ensure that it functions as it must function in order for this to be implemented. And then last but certainly not least, throughout this whole process, we have our North Carolina Technical Advisors. Their meeting is scheduled for mid-September, so they'll be looking at everything just one more time. And you may ask, well, why are you looking one more time? We're looking one more time because that's what we do. So we have full confidence to go forward in 2023-24 with statewide implementation for grades 4, 7, 5, and 8. We're still scaling out grades 3 and 6, but we have full confidence to go forward. But we know that our job and what you entrust us to do is to make sure that we review and review and review to make sure that we get it right for the children of North Carolina. So our next steps is to come back to you in October with another brief update, and then we plan to share with the state on October 6th our plans to go statewide in 2023-24. We do have those 2 reports. You'll be seeing those as well. We've had those reports every year as an annual occurrence. And of course, as I've already said, we're going to continue that communication with our stakeholders and making sure that they are involved in this decision and give us their feedback. So with that, I will pause for any questions, Ms. Kamnitz. Thank you.
As always, you make something very complicated sound understandable to all of us who are not trained in this. So thank you so much for that. I'm sure there's going to be some questions. I'm looking over there. Who wants to start?
My question, Dr. Howard. So presently, a lot of schools and teachers give pre-assessment and then benchmarks based on the standards covered within that quarter. And so with giving, I'm assuming that this multi-stage is still comprehensive the way that the summative is. So how do you assess, or how do we get to the assessment level for that summative when we know that students haven't covered all of the standards as they're taking this multi-stage? So, you know, in Q1, if I'm covering mostly reading literature standards with my 8th graders, and they haven't done much informational in that first multi-staged EOC, they're going to score high. And this, how does that come together to determine what form our kids end up taking at the end when we know we cover, to our previous presentation, when we're covering the standards in a different schedule? Or is the state going to put out a suggested order for which we teach the standards to go along with this.
So the NC check-ins 2.0, they differ a little bit from reading and math. So reading are all the same content standards for each one of those testing events. Math is where they're different, okay? Math is also going to vary across the state by pacing guides. What we learned along the way was rather than having strict administration windows for those NC check-ins 2.0, we leave that to the discretion at the local level. So there's 3. You can administer them in any order that you want to. Because it's going to be driven by when you're providing the instruction. That's more important than us having a specified window. So they open up, I believe, this year on September 15th. The EOC's opened up on September 1st. And then there's a close-up day at the end. And there is a date by which you have to have 2 in order to have that information for the multi-stage adaptive. So I think you're asking an excellent question, though, because to me the question is, so my student, maybe they don't do so well on NC Check-ins 2.0, right? And maybe by the end of the year, which is one of the reasons why the North Carolina General Assembly many years ago established our end-of-year testing window, because we want to give students as much time as possible to learn so that they can then show what they truly have learned in the full scope of that year. And North Carolina is one of the very few states, if not the only state, that does that. As you know, most states test beginning sometimes in April, moving into May, and they're done. So we go right to the very end. But my point is that this system is designed so that student is not disadvantaged. We want that student to do better, right? And I'm sure you do as well. So for that student that maybe did not do as well, and who knows why they did not do well. It may have been they had some struggles at the beginning of the year. Maybe they moved in to a school system and they took that first NC check-ins and that school system had to catch them up a little bit. Right? But nevertheless, when they take that end-of-grade multi-staged adaptive test at the end, everybody starts out from the same point in time. So it's like having a competition, that's not a good word, but a competition where the slate is wiped clean and then everybody is at ground zero and showing what they know and they can do. And their ability to do that is not driven by that form that is assigned.
To that point, just a quick follow-up, and this was not noted here, but thinking as a teacher, have there been any discussions about the multi-stage assessment being allowed as if those scores are higher than that summative, has there been any discussion about using that data for that 20% or whatever at the local level, since it is going to be a standardized assessment and it is measuring the same standards? Has there been any conversation about leeway and what's allowed to be used to create that summative?
Okay. So the intention all along has been to engage in this work and keep in mind, again, back to the General Assembly's intention of a through-grade model, back to the task force on summative assessment that very much wanted a through-grade model. Now, I will say there is a lot to think about, okay, because we're then layering accountability. We wouldn't have this report that we're just having necessarily today. We would have some vision of it 3 times during the school year, and students would be held to those high-stakes events. We have positioned NC Check-ins 2.0 as a classroom assessment that is centered on the teacher. It is not centered on accountability data. So we don't want it to be used for accountability. We don't recommend, we don't encourage it. We encourage it to be used for instruction. That's where we get the balanced assessment piece there. And that is very critical to this whole design. So I would just suggest at where we are at this point in our development and our understanding, and we continue to learn from others, experts in this field, as well as other states and what they do. But as we continue to do that, it is a very complex conversation to think about, do we really want to do that? So I'm sure we'll have those conversations. I'm sure we'll learn more. I will say that, and we, of course, this board recently adopted new science content standards, and we are having a conversation about science. Does science function differently? Because science functions for grades 5 and 8, not biology, but 5 and 8, they function on kits, is my understanding. And so the content is broken up more. So that's a very early conversation, but that just shows that you have to look at the content and how it's structured and your ability to do that, and then also then weigh all the pros and cons of doing that within our school communities. Okay.
Yes.
So I'm excited excited about this. We began using check-ins in the 2014-2015 school year, and the assessment for learning is beneficial for our teachers and our students. So thank you for your work on this. My question is about the form assignment, and specifically about if the Lexile ranges will vary for the forms. If you're creating an even playing field, will there be a variance of Lexile levels for those literacy passages in reading?
So we do provide a Lexile score for students that is aligned to their skill score, correct? But when we're building the assessments, we're not grounding them in that Lexile ranges, okay?
Oh, I'm aware.
Okay. So the answer would be that's really not in our methodology of determining those selections.
Okay.
We use a variety of reading measures because you get something different from all of them. And the most important part of those reading selections and affirming that they're grade level is expert opinion, particularly from teachers and other experts, to say, is this reading selection fourth grade? We can put all kinds of text and analyzers and get all kinds of results. Okay. Thank you.
I'm sure we could talk about this all morning, but we've got a lot coming down still to go. So maybe one more question from Vice Chair Duncan, and then we'll move on.
I think I understand this, but with respect to the summative test you're moving to, this approach that you described today, will there be comparability of testing data scores from previous years? Or I think I heard you say yes, but I'm not quite sure I fully understood how we got there. But you don't need to re-explain it.
Yes, the results from 2023-24 will include these results, and as did the results from 22-23 for those students in the pilot, and the results are comparable. It is not as it occurs when we change content standards. That's where sometimes we have a shift in comparability. But these assessments have been designed to where they are really the same from a technical, from Dr. Mabella's perspective. They are the same. They represent the same information as the current end of grade assessments.
Thank you.
All right. We are about to move on to our action on first read items, and Dr. Howard's not going to go anywhere, but I think we need to take a brief pause here. Am I correct, Dr. Peter-Martin? Yes. Brief as in not get up from the table. Right. There we go. Are we ready?
Okay, thank you.
I think I just saw a little drum roll from Mr. Black. So, yes.
Okay.
As we've anxiously been waiting. Dr. Howard.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Kamnitz. So to begin this morning, we want to once again remind ourselves that North Carolina has been reporting test results in an accountability model since the 1990s. And this is grounded on having technically sound assessments, which we just discussed, and accountability models that provide information that those schools can have improvement. That really goes back to 1965 with the Civil Rights Act, where the federal government first began giving significant money to states for education. The COVID pandemic, as we said last year, is the first ever statewide impact that disrupted administrations. Just to remind ourselves of where we have been the past 4 years, we all remember 2018-19 was the last year that we had results pre-pandemic. 2019-20, we did not have tests administered, we did not have an accountability model. 2020-21, we went back to administering tests in a very different environment due to COVID, but accountability was waived. And for the past 2 years, we have administered tests and we have accountability results reported. But we have to always remember very clearly that we are still in a pandemic environment and the impact that it has had on our students, on our teachers, on our schools, and on our communities at large. So we do provide in this report references to the 2018-19 data. That is given as a reference point. That is not given with the assumption that it is a one-to-one comparison of the results. So this morning we're going to look at several pieces of data, as you can see here, and we're going to start with participation results because that is always the first thing, is to make sure that the students take the test. We do look at participation on the whole, and we also look at participation for all of the identified subgroups listed here. And of course, the expectation is that participation is at least 95% of the population. So we have made some significant gains in this since the onset of the pandemic. You can see the statewide participation rate. If we just look at all the tests administered to all of the eligible students, that is at 99%. So only 1% did not take the test. So that is great news to share with you this morning. Now the target to the right side of that green circle, that is looking at the percent of schools that met all of their participation targets. So each school, depending on the subgroup populations that they have an identified subgroup of those previous ones we listed, then they're held to that participation. And of course the minimum in there is 30. So to have that subgroup, a school must have 30 students. And so this means that of all the schools in North Carolina that had this information, 82.7% of them met all of their participation targets. This is showing us the information by the targets by the subgroup. So this is a little different. This is, for example, saying for the Asian population, if you looked at all of the target subgroups that qualified at all the schools across the state, if you look at those for 2022-23, we had 96.7% meet those targets. And that actually is an increase from the previous school, from 2018-19, I believe. I can't see because of the script, of 97.3. But you can see the rest of those. The blue is not the recent year, the gray is the recent year, and you can see we are not back to where we were pre-pandemic when you slice the data in that way. But nevertheless, we have made great gains in participation. So now we're going to shift to the test results. And as a reminder, of course, we have test results for end of grade and end of course tests in reading, mathematics, and science. Level 3 and above is grade level proficiency, and level 4 and above is college and career readiness. We're going to walk through each one of these, and as we do, I just want to take the first one and talk about it a little bit, and then we'll probably move through the others a little bit quicker. So the first slide that we see here is the College Career Readiness Standard for reading, and of course that is level 4 and above. And the good news, and you'll see this through all the slides until we hit science, you will see for the most part, well, not even for the most part, you will see that for grades 3 through 8, reading and math, college career readiness, and grade level proficiency, there were increases across the board when looking backward to 2001-22. So the general takeaway here is the percentage of students meeting this standard has increased from the previous school year for all grades. Grade 4 had the largest increase of 2.9 percentage points, and grade 8 had the smallest with 0.3 percentage points. This slide you'll also see for every slide that I just referenced previously. And just to describe this a little bit, that solid blue line at the very top, that is showing the participation target of 95. And since you only see that solid blue line, then that means for reading grades 3 through 8, that participation target was met. So that is where we want to see that blue line. We then provide in the bar charts and in the chart below all of the information by subgroup. So you can see going back to, for each one of the grade levels, how the different subgroups performed. So grade 3, end of grade reading performance, level 3 and above, again, is grade level proficiency. Again, we see that increase with grade 4 at 3.8%, the largest, and grade 8 with the smallest at 0.3 percentage points. And again, the similar graph here. Moving to mathematics, where we see the gains are a little bit more. Again, consistent increases across each grade level from the previous year, with the largest again at grade 4, 4.1 percentage points, and the smallest now has shifted to grade 7 with 1.5 percentage points. But you can even see that smallest is still much smaller than it was for reading. And then grade level proficiency, we see the same results, a larger increase, 5.3, again grade 4, and grade 7 remained at 1.5, being the smallest increase. So this is science looking at grades 5 and 8, and we can see here for grade 5, it did increase by 2.3 percentage points. This is the College Career Readiness Standard. For grade 8, we saw a decrease of 4.1. And again, you see the participation there as well. Looking at grade level proficiency, grade 5 increased 2.1 percentage points, and grade 8 had another decrease of 3.1. And I must say, we're a little bit surprised. We were very used to science being a top performer and staying kind of ahead of the game of all the other subjects and grade levels. So we're not sure why we're seeing this decrease for grade 8, but it is one of the notable takeaways from this report. So now looking at our end of course performance, first looking at college career readiness. Consistent with the past couple of years, we're seeing that NC Math 3 continues to exceed pre-COVID performance. Pre-COVID, it was at 26.2. It is now at 36.0. And you can see in that bar chart how from 2020-21, you can see that steady increase every year for NC Math 3 that continues to occur. NC Math 1, and these results are for high school only, and biology had increases, but not at COVID performance levels, and of course, English 2 had a decrease. And then we see the same reflection here for grade level proficiency for the end of course assessments, and you can see again what we're seeing with NC Math 3, with NC Math 1, and with biology, and then English 2, of course, had that decrease. We provide this information on this slide looking at math, because remember, NC Math 1 is administered to some 8th graders. And a few years ago, prior to the pandemic, North Carolina got permission to not require students in grade 8 to take both the grade 8 end of grade math assessment and the NC Math 1 assessment. So that means that when we're looking at grade 8 math results on this slide, to the far left, you see grade 8 math broken out by itself. But remember, that's our grade 8 students without their peers who are taking NC Math 1 or 2, that's right, or 2 in many instances, that's right. So if the previous slides that I shared for grade 8, we coupled together the grade 8 and the NC Math 1. So that's why if you go back, you'll see those numbers are a little different. But for this purpose, we're just trying to break out math completely around that NC Math 1. So then you can see the grade 8 NC Math 1 scores broken out by themselves, and you can see all NC Math 1 together. That's all students who took NC Math 1. And then you can see grades 9 through 12 who took NC Math 1. And of course, you see the difference there as well when you compare it to those 8th graders that took NC Math 1. And then the very last set is again our NC Math 3. So shifting now to the ACT, this is the percentage of 11th graders who have a composite score of at least 19, measuring English, reading, mathematics, and science. Participation rate did go up to greater than 95%, up from 94% in 2021-22. So we were very pleased to see this. And the percentage of students meeting that ACT minimum score of 19 in 2021-22 was 41.7. And for this, and it's cutting it off, I think it's 41.4. Is that correct? 40, okay. And here we have it broken out by subgroup, 41.1. Thank you, Maria. So 41.1 in 2022-23, it was 41.7 in 2021-22. Now, the number of students that took that test, remember, we noted that the participation had increased, and so we had more students taking that test as well. Not sure if that's a factor or not, but that is something to note. Now here we can see we don't have that solid blue line for participation. You see the little bouncy line below the orange line. The orange line is where we want the participation, and then you can see with these subgroups where they weren't quite meeting that participation. Work keys, of course, is the percentage of 12th graders who are career and technical education concentrators, and they receive a silver certificate or better. Their participation has always been the lowest of everything that we assess. This year is 92%. That's up from 89% in 2021-22. So that is great news. And you can see they did have an increase in the number of certificates awarded that are silver or better for 0.8 percentage points. And it seemed like a lot of subgroups for this particular assessment that did have increases, and we highlighted those in yellow on this slide. But again, we see the story here with participation when you see that bumpy line, and I'm sure you would agree this is the most bumpy line that we have seen this morning. Now, we do, of course, include in the accountability model the percentage of students that meet either the ACT benchmark or the WorkKeys benchmark, and those are students in grade 12. And you can see for 2022-23, that was 54.4, and in 2021-22, it was 53.2. So it did have an increase. And math course rigor, which is not an assessment, is the percent of students that get a passing grade from their teacher for NC Math 3. You can see that is at 94.7. So we also administer an English language proficiency assessment, and unfortunately this assessment has not been trending back toward 2018-19 as much as we would like to see it to do. The measure that is used for the accountability is that third column over, that total EL progress. In 2018-19 it was 38.6. It is now 24.9%. So the growth results for the 2022-23 school year, I apologize, I can't always see the bottom. I'm going to get mine. This is why I bring paper copies. So looking at school accountability growth, we had 72.7% of schools meeting or exceeding growth, and you can see the comparison to the previous school years, 2018-19 as well as 2021-22, that this distribution has been relatively stable with the output of growth. We break this down as well by school type, elementary, middle, and high school. And you can see here there is some differences across those different school types. The elementary schools have 78.4% meeting or exceeding growth. This slide is showing growth status by subgroup. We do run growth statuses just like we do for the entire school. It's also run for all of the different subgroups across the state, and this shows for those subgroups that met the minimum N of 30, because a school has to have 30 students in a subgroup for it to count in this data, then we're seeing the distribution, if you will, of exceeded, met, or did not meet. Now we take all of that information and we put it together for the school performance grades. And of course the school performance grades are based 80% achievement and 20% growth. And I think as we walk through these subsequent slides, as we have seen in previous years, the weight of this 80% achievement does have an impact on these results. And of course this includes the annual EOG assessments in reading and mathematics, grades 3 through 8, science 5 and 8, our end of course test, NC Math 1, NC Math 3, and English 2. NC Math 3 is for those students who took NC Math 1 in middle school. They have to have a separate high school measure. Percent of English learners who met progress standard on the English language proficiency test, and the percentage of students that graduate within 4 years is federal law to include that 4-year cohort graduation rate. We also include growth, which we just reviewed. Also biology, which you'll notice I did not mention. It is in high school as another indicator. Also the percentage of students who completed NC Math 3 with a passing grade, and the percentage of 12th graders, again, we already mentioned, who meet either the ACT or the WorkKeys model. You can see the distribution of the grades along the bottom of this slide. And again, just to remind us that to be included in the model, a school has to have 30 students for an indicator. If a school does not have 30 students for an indicator, it is not used. If a school only has one indicator, that indicator is used to generate a school performance grade. So this is the distribution for the school performance grades for 2022-23. And again, as a reference point only, we are providing the 2018-19 numbers as well as the 2021-22 numbers. And if you focus on the comparison to 2021-22, you can see that A, B, and C's increased, which is where we want to see that go, and D's and F's decreased. So that is absolutely good news. Now, this is a new slide that we've prepared, and it's one that requires a little bit of studying, but I find it engaging, and Dr. Marr referenced us to this and thought this would be a good depiction of this information. So if you look on the far left for this slide, we're looking at 2018-19. On the far right is 2022-23. Those solid bars that just go straight across horizontally, those are schools that were A's in 2018-19, and they retained their A in 2022. And then you start seeing all those wavy lines. So if you see the wavy line that goes from A on the left down to B on the right, that's an A school in 2018-19 that now is a B school. Now, when we look at this comparison to 2018-19 to 2022, notice all of those thin lines. And some of them are going to adjacent, and some of them are skipping one, right? So if you look down, you can see there's a little wispy line, we'll say it positively, where a school was a D in 2018-19 now has a B. So it goes both ways, right? It can go up and it can go down. But the more lines you see, the more movement that is going on. So just kind of think, if you will, here, all of these lines that we're seeing, and then consider what we see comparing 2021-22 to 2022-23. We don't see as many lines here, but nevertheless, to me, this data is looking much more stable. We're seeing much more consistency. Notice the wider, even with the C, those schools that are maintaining those Cs, and yet we have a pretty thick line, not too thick really, but going from the C to the B. So the thicker the line, the more schools it represents. So school performance grades by growth designation, this is just taking those schools and looking at schools that met or exceeded growth and doing the distribution of their school performance grades. And you can see very clearly that those that do not meet growth do not have as strong of a distribution of those letter grades as schools that do. And again, we always look at school performance grades by school type. We share this information every year. And again, going back to that 80-20 split for achievement and growth, and also with the high schools having more indicators. So the high schools have the ACT, they have work keys, they have math course rigor, they have cohort graduation rate. When we look at our elementary and middle schools, they are very centered on test scores for reading and math and science. And of course, they have English language proficiency, which they all have, and they have growth. But you can see the distribution there is very much different for high schools than it is for elementary and middle. And then we also report school performance grades for reading and mathematics for grades 3 through 8. And consistent with the data that we've already shared on the mathematics performance, we can see here that the mathematics is performing stronger than reading, which I think is consistent with what we have seen in previous years and what we're seeing across the nation at large. And then once again, we look at this for school performance grades by subgroup. That information is always extremely helpful. And so looking at these color bars, we can see the distribution of those letter grades, because every subgroup, again, with that minimum N of 30, gets a letter grade. So we're going to shift to long-term goals. Long-term goals is a federal requirement. It is part of the ESSA state plan. It consists of the following subgroups that you see on the left. And for that, we use the level 4 and above, so that is a higher standard than the level 3 and above. And we're looking to see if those targets are met, because we have progress targets with a 10-year intention of getting to a long-term goal, which is the title of this. We also look at English learner progress, and we also look at 4-year cohort graduation rate as well. So for 2022-23, we of course want to remind ourselves that in COVID, we did extend by 2 years the long-term goal and shifted those progress targets forward. But nevertheless, when we look at those long-term goals as they were set pre-COVID, we have to remember that that was a pre-COVID expectation. And that, therefore, we look at this, the only group that met at the state level the long-term goal, the progress target, is the Asian subgroup for the 4-year cohort graduation rate. So that means all of the other targets were not met. But again, we have to remember that was definitely a pre-COVID expectation on those goals. We do have a system For alternative schools where they have options where they can either report a school performance grade, as we have been discussing this morning, they can report the state-developed alternative system, or they can develop their own reporting system for their performance. So they have options A, B, and C. We can see here for 2022-23, we did have one school that availed itself of the traditional school performance grade. We had 77 schools that participated in option B, which is the state system, and then we had 17 that designed their own system, and all of those are available on the NCDPI website for further review. State and federal designations. We're going to begin with the state designations, and of course, a low-performing school has a school performance grade of D or F and a growth status of met or not met. A low-performing district is a district that has greater than 50% of their schools identified as low-performing. Recurring low-performing school is a school that has low-performing for any 2 of the previous 3 years, and a continuing low-performing charter is the same, a school performance grade or any 2 of the previous 3 years. So these are the results for 2022-23, and the comparison that we have here in the parentheses for 2021-22 is back to 2018-19. For 2022-23 is to 2021-22. And you can see in 2022-23 for low-performing schools, we have 60 fewer than were identified last year, 4 fewer low-performing districts, but we have 194 more low-performing recurring low-performing schools and 22 additional continuing low-performing charter schools. There are also federal designations that we report. These fall into 2 categories: comprehensive support and improvement and targeted support and improvement. You can see the definitions there as well. And then looking at this, unlike the state designations, we do not identify these every year. So you can see the schedule here, and the one that is identified this year and is identified every year, it's the only one that is the targeted support and improvement consistently underperforming subgroups. And for the identification at this point in time, it now is 1,079, and that is with 83 that exited and 122 that were newly identified. So we're now going to shift to the cohort graduation rate. As a reminder, these are reports for students who entered 9th grade in the 2018-19 school year, graduating in 4 years. 5 years would be those students that entered 9th grade in 2017-18. Students are removed if they meet criteria such as transferring to another school that grants diplomas. They are added if they transfer into a school, and they retain always that initial 9th grade identification. So that means that if a student moves into my school and they are off track, I still take them in with that 9th grade year. There is no adjustment for the fact that they came to me off track. So the cohort graduation rate for 2022-23 is the same as it was in 2021-22, which is 86.4%. This is slightly down from 2020-21 at 87%, but we are not really surprised to see that. And then this information, of course, provides more detail on those subgroups once more. So now, in conclusion, the takeaways we feel is that the state level participation is greater than 95%. If you think about all the participation conversations we had during COVID, then this is very good news for the assessment and the accountability reports. All EOGs and EOCs increased from the previous year, with the exception of grade 8 science for college career readiness and grade level proficiency, and English 2 college and career readiness. And of course, mathematics has larger increases than reading. Once more, compared to 2021-22, we saw an increase of the A's, the B's, and the C's, and the D's and the F's decreased for school performance grades. And schools continue to meet and exceed growth, 72.3% of the 2,561 schools that had a growth status. So these results are similar to what we've been seeing across other states that have released their test results, and that we're seeing progress back toward our pre-COVID levels. May not be 100% back to where we were, but there's definite progress being seen here. And one more note is that the distribution of the school performance grades continues to be related to the weighting of the model on those achievement scores. We have a very strong test-centered accountability model. So of course, the primary purpose of an accountability model is to provide information for school improvement. And so with that, once we give this report and share this data, we really turn things over to our colleagues. Alex Charles, who is the interim director for the Office of Federal Program Monitoring, and Dr. Cynthia Martin, who is the senior director of the Office of District and Regional Support. So they take all of this information and use it as it is intended to support those schools that have been identified that need the most support. And with that continued on, I'm sure we'll make progress to continue. So, yes.
Sorry, go ahead. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
So next steps, of course, we always have our data correction window, September 6th to the 15th. We will bring back any of those corrections to you on October 4th for your final approval. And then, of course, effective immediately, already I'm sure, we have available on our NCDPI website very detailed spreadsheets giving every information for every public school unit across the state. And we also have a disaggregated test data site that we unveiled last year that had test data, and this year we're adding cohort graduation rate to it as well. And it's very interactive. We're very excited about that. Thank you.
So I just was going to ask for clarity. When did the districts have access to their own data? Was it this morning or previous to?
So through our internal review process, they actually see their, locally, public school unit sees their information as we get it and finalize it. Now, part of that is so they can look for those data corrections, right? They're partners with us in looking at this data. I don't think we could do it without them. So Curtis Sonneman, who is the section chief for analysis and reporting, does an excellent job on that communication and getting that information out to them as soon as possible. The test scores they had in July. They got the growth information early August, say. Then, of course, we have to run the school performance grades. There's a lot of quality control checks. We share it with the understanding that, of course, things can change, so be very careful. It is embargoed, and it is on a need-to-know basis only. But the reason we have that system, in addition to that checks and balances, is also to make sure that they have information as soon as they can for their instructional planning. So.
Thank you for that clarification. Questions for Dr. Howard on this massive amount of data?
Just to be clear, the schools, the districts, know today which of their schools is A, B, C, D, or F. They have that information.
Yes, that is correct.
We don't have it.
You do have, well, you have access to the website that has every school broken down. There is attached to your board agenda item an annual testing report, and in that, at the back of it, you will see your region that has summary data for your region. The intensity of putting all that for every school, but you definitely have access to that website, so you could go, and we'll be glad to assist you if that would be helpful to anyone, where you can sort for your region or any district and see all those results. But it is live and available.
I saw that.
Okay.
What you're talking about. But I didn't see the school and the districts. Right. What you were saying, yes.
Absolutely. Yes.
And that's my
there.
question. I mean,
yes, you can see that. Anyone can see that. It is public. It has gone live. And so what schools have not been able to see, what districts have not been able to see, is their neighbor. Now, we did give them the statewide data yesterday, which is what I've shared with you, and that is so they would have some context for where they were as they planned their communication locally, but we don't give them their neighbors. So now everybody can see their neighbors, they can see all of the information, and that's anybody that has internet access.
It was interesting to see also that the recurring low-performing schools went up.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
And I wonder what's going on there. I'm just wondering to myself, for an increase in about 200, about the 194, something like that.
I think Superintendent Truitt wants to.
Awesome. Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Camden. So I think it's important for the board to have a little bit of context. into these designations, these letter grades that have been assigned to these schools. As Dr. Howard stated, these grades, as the board knows, are still largely based on test scores that occur on one day at one time. There can be any number of reasons why a child may not do as well. Even just thinking about the ACT scores, which our universities are not even requiring anymore, yet we are so mandating our 11th graders to take. I have to ask the question, are our 11th graders taking these tests seriously, knowing that they're not going to be used for anything? And so this is why the department has been doing work over the last 2 years with the assistance of our local superintendents to figure out a better way to describe or assign school quality and student success. And just to give you an example of what we uncovered when we looked at how other states do their state accountability model. Arizona only has 7% of their schools designated as a D or an F. Florida has 6% of their schools designated as a D or an F. Texas has 8% of their schools designated as a D or F. North Carolina has 42% of their schools designated as a D or an F. So while on the one hand, we do need to pay attention to proficiency rates, which count for 80% of this grade, which would let us know, and our ACT scores bear this out, that our students are not proficient in math, and they are not proficient in reading. And many people are working to improve these proficiency rates. And so I would encourage us to really think about proficiency rates as we are continuing to work through how to rewrite our school accountability model so that it does a better job of reflecting the work that goes into educating our students. And I can see that Dr. Marr is at the podium, so I'll allow him to weigh in if it's okay, Ms. Kamens.
Yes, of course, Dr. Marr.
Mr. Hall, just to your question about the recurring low performing, right? So it's 2 out of 3 years. And one of the things we want folks to remember is that would mean we had this huge increase in the number of schools, right, during the COVID year. Mm-hmm. So we had that large increase. You could have a school that perhaps had never been on that list before, went on as a result of COVID, was still on this year because they're still trying to claw back, right? And now they're on the list again. And so it's quite possible that we're still seeing the impact of the pandemic in this kind of longer term. And if you'll remember, several years ago, I talked about this being really a 4 or 5 year process. We're only in year 2, really. So I just want folks to bear that in mind. And to the superintendent's point, you know, you see these large numbers of DNF schools in North Carolina as compared to places like Arizona and Florida. However, if you look at our NAEP performance data, we are equal to or better than each of those states. So again, to the point about being really careful about the school performance grades still at this time as being an indicator of whatever we want to assign that. Yep.
Your point is well taken about the low performance, the recurring schools, and that point in time. Remember, you stand up here talking about that. But that's what I need to be reminded of, and that's what some of our people need to be reminded of. But I don't think they're being reminded of exactly what I'm hearing again, which helps me. But going back to Arizona and Florida and da-da-da-da-da, if I remember correctly, and you can help me with this, they don't measure the same thing that we measure.
Correct.
So their measuring stick is different from ours. And we have always, those of us in this business, have always had problems with 80-20 from day one. I remember when it first popped out. And all of us said, what in the world? Because growth is not taken into account, like other states take it into account. And I'll just shut up there, but thank you for that. But it just struck me and said, wait a minute, what's going on here? And we're not comparing apples to apples.
Now, the only way we can compare apples to apples is to look at our NAEP data, which shows that we are performing on a par with those other states, as Dr.
And when that is publicized, then that needs to be highlighted, emphasized to some degree. We are not, as a D school to me, and I must say it, is not a D school. Because within that school, there are pockets of growth, proficiency, but because of that 80 sitting over there, it sort of erases it to me. And every teacher and every educator out there, my hands off, especially going through COVID time. And I'll just, thank you, madam.
Yes, and I mean, as Dr. Howard made clear at the onset of her presentation, we are not post-COVID yet. We are still.
We're still into it.
And to that point, as Dr. Marr said, we are in year 2 of COVID recovery. And one of the indicators of that is our levels of chronic absenteeism, which correlate to learning loss, which make it harder for students to gain. Last year, we were still at a level of 31%. In other words, a third of kids in North Carolina are missing more than 10 days of school per year. And this is, as compared to other states in the South, not a good number. And so chronic absenteeism is a measure that we want to include in a new school accountability proposal.
Thank you so much for that, because I'm hearing more and more about school districts now emphasizing more accountability and those kids being in those seats daily. And there's been a little pushback, you know, when you said, well, you got to be here, you know, and if you're not in that seat, then we can't provide quality instruction. And you're absolutely right there.
Yes, Dr.
Just very quickly, I certainly appreciate the effort and the thinking that's going around, that's being invested in rethinking our accountability model. I absolutely do, and I appreciate all the hard work and meetings and other processes that are going into that. But one thing that just constantly stays in my head when I hear this conversation is that we can change the accountability model and we can come up with other indicators of school success. And I know that there are other indicators of school success. Trust me, I do. But aside from that, we can't ignore the reality of we still have school students in those schools who are not doing well, folks, who can't read and they can't write. Well, they can't. I wish we had a writing test. I'm not popular for saying that, but they can't read. They can't do math. There's so many other things that we cannot lose sight of that. No matter how we go about finding other indicators of success. I don't want us to camouflage with a new system, to camouflage and bury what is could be a very, very serious problem in the education of our kids and to North Carolina society in general.
Vice Chair Duncan, and then we'll move on.
2 comments. Amen to Brother Hall's sermon. I think he pointed out a number of things that should be considered when you're trying to take into account what these things mean. And when the information is distributed more publicly, it's often not done in the thoughtful way that Mr. Hall just described. B, I remain extremely concerned about the achievement gaps that exist within different groups, and I don't see any meaningful improvement in that, and that is a siren call for all of us, that we need to very much focus on what we do to change that dynamic. And I've unfortunately been feeling that for decades, and like many of you, and I don't want to feel it for decades more, so we need to really continue our efforts in a more meaningful way, in a different way that changes that dynamic. I have 2 more specific area questions. On the grade 4 scores, would you agree those are statistically significant changes in grade 4?
Yes, particularly at the state level. So the state level, to get any movement, is typically significant. Now, of course, if it was, 0.001, that might be different. But particularly with looking at whole numbers, most definitely.
There's a phrase, standard deviations. Are there any standard deviation? I mean, it appeared to me that the standard deviation on the grade 4 numbers is out of the norm.
Yeah, well, I would have to go back and look at that. I will say that whenever we notice an uptick or when we notice a downtick, like with the grade 8 science, then Dr. Mabella goes back and looks very carefully at that data and that information to affirm that there is nothing that could have absolutely gone wrong. So, and he would have that more detailed information, and we can absolutely get that for you if that would be helpful.
I appreciate hearing more about that, because the question in my mind is, was there an issue with last year's grade 4 test? Is there an issue with this year's grade 4 test?
Right.
Of some form. So if Dr. Novella has some insights on that after further review, I think we'd all appreciate that.
Okay,
Those
thank you.
insights. And then my second and last area is the districts that are coming out low performing on one chart, I think it's 63. There's two questions. One, it says recurring low performing schools, then it says continually low performing charter schools. Is there any difference between the words recurring or continuing? Is there any definitional difference between those two terms?
The definition is exactly the same. It's just in the law, that is how they're referenced.
Different word, same thing.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for that.
Criteria are the same.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. The low performing districts, we've got a net, I'm assuming a net perhaps, of 4 that are no longer in there, and I know you don't, I would like a list of all the schools, as Mr. Hall has indicated as well, but when on the districts, can you tell us what districts came out of low performing?
I do not know off the top of my head, but I can get that for you, absolutely. We can send that to Dr. Petrie Martin, and she can give that to you this afternoon.
That'd be very good. We certainly want to celebrate the good work that's being done in those districts that are making those changes, and this is the appropriate occasion to commend them for the efforts that they've undertaken. So thank you if you can get that to us.
And learn from them.
Yes.
Yes.
Chair Davis, I said last one.
Thank you.
Get to end it.
So I agree with my colleagues' comments, particularly around school performance grades. They have far too long been used as tools to label our schools as failure, and that's just completely wrong. But the reality is that when parents look at our schools to determine where to send their children, what they see first and most are the school performance grades. They're having a damaging impact upon our students' education and our parents' choices. And we need to change that. And I agree with the work that's being done to change that. I'd remind the public that this board, as late as 2015, when our ESSA plan was being developed, favored and supported a multiple measures way of determining school and student performance. And we still support that method. And the question is, how long is it going to take us to get there? Every day that goes past, to Dr. Oxendine's point, is a detriment to our students' education. And it's our primary job to raise the performance of our students and the performance of our schools. We have a 7-step comprehensive plan that would address the very issues that our teachers are facing and our students are facing. And it's time that this state move forward implementing that plan, setting aside our differences and moving forward for the benefit of our students and teachers. What this report shows is that we need that comprehensive plan implemented rapidly. Thanks.
Thank you for ending us with that thought. All right, we'll move on to discussion items, and one more time, Dr. Howard, but I think this one can be extremely short because we actually touched on that in the previous report and the 3 categories for alternative schools. So these are the requests for this year, I think.
Yes, this is in reference to the alternative schools' opportunity to designate if they would avail themselves of option A, which is a school performance grade. Option B is the state-defined model, or option C, do their own model for the upcoming school year. These are submitted to you annually. For the 2023-24 school year, again, one school is electing to do option A, 76 are indicating option B, and 17 option C. And that is consistent with what we also showed earlier this morning. Those individual plans for the 17 are attached to this board item that you can review more closely if so desired. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. Thank you so much for that long go. A second discussion item is SLA 4, which is also a report to the General Assembly. This one on educational performance of children with disabilities and implementation of policies to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. And I will turn it over to Dr. Hutchins.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
I have before you a report today that is a combination of two reports. The first part is the educational performance of children with disabilities. This speaks to the reporting requirement from the General Assembly to provide all the information required to make public under the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Act. And these data are summarized under the state performance plan and annual performance report. The second part of this overall report is the implementation of policies to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. And since these reports are now combined, I've chosen to highlight specific actions that the state has taken in correlation to the state's performance plan, so we can see what the state has done in response to those indicators that suggest we need to support our public school units differently. And so when we look at our educational performance of children with disabilities, if you'll go back to one slide, thank you. I need to point out that these data are for the 21-22 school year. And so after we've just heard a lot of information about the 22-23 school year, I think that's important to note. And why these data are coming before you at this time is that because of the reporting requirement, and when we collect and report to the federal government, we base our data on the July 1 to June 30 school year. And so this data for this report was collected in October of 22, which means we reported it federally in February of 23. And we just received our determination from the federal government on the 21-22 data in June of 23. And so I offer that chronology for you just to show that it is delayed, and we do rely on sources such as what Dr. Howard has provided us for school improvement planning and real-time data behind our compliance and performance indicators so that we can support districts in their ongoing improvement activities adjacent to this federal reporting requirement. And so you will note that based on the data collected for 21-22 and obviously established by the comparison and the chronology of post-COVID activities, North Carolina was determined to need assistance in the implementation of services for children with disabilities. To put that in a national context for you, 23 states met requirements, and 35 states, of which North Carolina was one, need assistance. However, the requirement that we must follow as corrective action for this designation is that the Office of Special Ed Programs is requiring us to participate and partner with various technical assistance agencies that correlate to the indicators that they're measuring. And so there are no other corrective actions, no contingencies upon our IDEA federal grant, but continued partnership to problem solve improving outcomes for students with disabilities. So the second part of the report, and I just need to go back just 1 second. As a result of that report, there are 14 indicators that we collect data from our public school units for. Those indicators are a combination of outcome data and compliance data. So the outcome data, we work with our stakeholders to set targets that we believe are reasonable for improving our outcomes for students with disabilities. Compliance indicators are set by the federal government, and those are generally all 100%. And so that is a high bar that we continue to reach and strive for through continuous improvement. And based on these data, we have identified the priority areas of support to our public school units to be the participation and performance on statewide assessments. So it was good to hear from Dr. Howard's report that participation has increased overall last year. Suspension and expulsion rates for students with disabilities, preschool outcomes, child find and early childhood transition, secondary transition, and post-school outcomes are those outcome measures that we have identified based on the targets that our public school units need more assistance with. And so then I segue into part 2 of the report, and I highlighted activities that fall in that same data collection year, just for reference, so that since these are paired together, I wanted activities to be correlated to the data collection year as well. And so you will see in your materials and on the slide
our activities around reading and math, looking at our specialty areas as a result of a student's disability, particularly in the areas of dyslexia and dyscalculia. However, we also are partnering with our general ed folks because our special ed programs are to support students and their involvement in general education programs. So we have had our consultants participate in the letters training. We're also having our early learning sensory support teachers participate in letters training this year because they are responsible for supporting our children who are deaf or hard of hearing or have visual impairments as they transition from preschool into kindergarten. And letters is certainly a very important tool to have in your toolbox as we're working to support them in transitioning into public schools and in their general ed settings. You'll note too that there is, or there were and continue to be activities around the extended content standards. You heard us partner with curriculum and instruction on the development of the science standards recently, and collaborative training for transition with career tech and vocational rehabilitation. And then Project Aware is our activities with school-based mental health. We have 6 pilot sites, and our early data is showing that some of those efforts can be correlated to decreases in suspension because of some of those supports that are available. And so what I would like to point out now is our current activities. We look forward certainly to unpacking further our subgroup from the information that Dr. Howard shared today, and in forecasting and preparing for that and looking at what Superintendent Truitt has asked us to do through Operation Polaris with our support to districts and the strategic plan of eliminating opportunity gaps, we took a look at what we were doing in curating our support that is based on data, and in particular our SMART goals around the continuum of services based on needs expressed by the school or the district and upon data. And so what you see before you is called a few different things in our office. It's called the book, it's called the playbook, but essentially it's a compilation of all the activities that we hope to offer and support our public school units with this school year. And it starts off with hyperlinks to the data dashboard of the state performance plan and annual performance report that we've highlighted for you. And then it correlates to all of our communication loops, all of our supports, our professional learning, and different opportunities to engage with not only our local leaders, but teachers as well. And our professional development opportunities have objectives that are correlated to the indicators that I shared at the beginning of the presentation. And so we think that this is a good faith effort to compile what is a lot from our office in a place that can streamline the focus and improvement efforts with a one-stop, if you will, to know how our office wants to engage with the field and how we can support you and message that ahead of time so that as districts are prioritizing their opportunities for engagement and scaling up their programs, they know it well in advance. So if they choose to engage and train the trainer models and so forth, they are using their human capital in a reasonable way and can plan ahead for things such as deadlines, training opportunities, and just knowing what's out there with no surprises we think will help the stress not roll down or back up, but rather it is a continuous improvement that we are linked together with to accomplish. So we are asking that you consider this report for discussion this time and action in October because it's due October 15th.
Thank you, Dr. Hutchins. Any questions? All right, hearing none, we will look forward to acting on this next month.
Okay.
We have one final discussion item, which is a report to the General Assembly on the Career and College Ready Graduate Program and program outcomes. I think Dr. Mullenix and Ms. Shoulders-Royster are going to do this presentation for us today. I would just ask you, since we are running a little late, to sort of try and streamline it a bit if you can.
Perfect. Got it. I can do that. Michael Marr will also be closing us out today.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So just to remind everyone, CCRG is a partnership between the community college system, DPI, and the legislated vendor, the NROC project, or EdReady is also another name for them. It is a legislated mandate, and the purpose is essentially so that students can go to North Carolina community colleges remediation-free. This is aligned to goals 1 and 2 of the State Board of Education strategic goals. And then you have heard about CCRG before now, although this is our first full year of implementation that we just wrapped up. This began back in 2016 with statewide pilots fostered by the community college system, as well as statewide training between DPI and the community college system. We had a partial implementation that was met with pandemic and financial challenges during 2020, 2021. There was no implementation the following year because it was an unfunded mandate. And that brings us to this current year that we'll talk about today. We received the funding for the NROC project platform, as well as one full-time equivalent, which is Dr. Erica Shoulders-Royster, who you will hear from shortly. And then we have continued on with our academic year that we are in now, 2023-2024. We have renewed the contract with NROC Project. We are awaiting information from the community college system to provide professional development. And in the meantime, we are providing office hours to our public school units. As a reminder, CCRG is guided by the evaluation plan you see on the screen. I know that is very difficult to see, but today you will hear about those strategies and some of those outcomes that we have met. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Erica Shoulders-Royster. She joined us about a year ago. She was a principal in Franklin County Schools, and she's going to talk to us a little bit more about the data.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Mullenix, and thank you all for supporting CCRG. The data sources we will review today include an optional survey we sent out to staff and students. We had over 600 student participants and over 200 staff participants. We will also review other data sources such as the Canvas course analytics as well as the tier test completions. The first 3 evaluation questions that you see I will cover include cross-sector partnerships between community college system and DPI, resources and tools, as well as quality of support. Staff were provided 20 professional development sessions and over 90 office hours. Staff respondents felt like they knew who to contact and received a timely response from a cross-sector partner. And looking at the cross-sector partnership, as you can see in the graph to the left, it depicts the response to the optional staff survey I mentioned earlier. In general, staff strongly agreed that we provided adequate support to them during this first year of implementation. They had ongoing access to regular professional development, technical assistance, and supportive supplemental resources. We also provided over 20 professional development, as I shared earlier, and 90 office hours. CCRG was met with several resources and tools for implementation, such as professional development options, as well as office hours and technical assistance. We provided updated frequently asked questions. We had our first ever website launched this year, and Canvas course and training materials were updated on a regular basis. As the CCRG administrator, I constantly was in contact with district personnel and CCRG leads to ensure that they had the necessary resources and tools. Moving on to quality of support. We had over more than, which is I'm happy about, 1,000 educators that actively engage in the CCRG resources course. They typically participated in August and January. You'll see a higher concentration during that time. This is at the beginning of each school term. The CCRG instructors across the state who reiterated how much support they felt from Canvas course and other resources and tools. Next, we'll look at the next two evaluation questions, which covers criteria to determine eligibility for CCRG and participation rates amongst our students. As you can see from the graph, CCRG has eligibility and exemption criteria. All of this was set forth by the community college system, and you can see that on the screen in front of you. The criteria vary for English as well as math. As for eligibility and participation, the unweighted GPA is consistent for both content areas, 2.2 to 2.799. And of the optional survey respondents, more than 50% said that the GPA was what they used to maintain eligibility. Students also shared that they learned about CCRG from their teacher. Districts followed state guidelines by implementing and sharing information with parents. They were notified, and students also received counseling when necessary about CCRG at the school level. And there were lots and plenty of information ensuring that students knew about CCRG and had the necessary access. So, in taking a deeper dive into CCRG participation, my colleague Kaylin was able to run some demographics data for you that you can see on the screen. As you see at the graph to the left, students were more likely to be male. A greater percentage are economically disadvantaged, and more than 50% of CCRG students identify students as students of color, and multilingual and academically and intellectually gifted students equate for less than 10% of the population. As I noted throughout the presentation, we received a great response rate from the optional survey that was given. I'll review a couple of the summary responses from our students. Majority of the students felt they had enough time to complete the CCRG coursework and take tier tests for credit. Less than 25% of our students felt that the content helped them learn new material. It's important to note that CCRG content is remedial. Slightly more than 25% felt that CCRG will save them money for college, and our students share some key programmatic improvements related to accessibility to the platform as well as clear content language. They were not shy in sharing their feedback. Similarly, with our staff respondents, they also had some key things to share. Majority of staff felt that the support that they needed, they received for implementation. Many staff felt and found it difficult to motivate students around CCRG, and staff provided some key programmatic improvements, which included easier navigation, funding for additional teachers, greater clarity and purpose for the content, more support and communication with the local community colleges, and separating English out from the English 4 content for greater flexibility. So our final evaluation question is regarding student CCRG coursework completion. Thank you. So students must pass the math tier test to receive credit for math towards the community college system to enter remediation free. It took, if you look at the screen, Math 1, Math 2, and Math 3 students had over 80% pass rate. In the pass columns, over 4,000 students passed Math 1, over 3,000 passed Math 2, and over 2,000 passed Math 3. So our students performed at a high pass rate for math. As we look at the English, we see a different story. Please keep in mind that the English CCRG is embedded in English 4 only. We had 7 to 10% pass rate for English. And looking at the numbers, 742 students passed English 1, 120 students passed English 2. Note that in the attempts column, there is a number of students that attempted to pass. So 5,397 students made attempts to pass English 1, and over 2,000 made attempts in English 2. This is a drastic number of difference for our students completing CCRG English compared to the math. With that being said, I am now going to turn it over to Dr. Michael Marr to close us out with recommendations and conclusions. Thank you.
Okay, so I do want to thank Dr. Shoulders-Royster and the team for putting this data together, and just remind folks that this is, in fact, kind of the first year of full kind of implementation of this program that we do in partnership with the community college system. So first off, it is really important that we continue to have a sustained level of funding in order to implement the program effectively. We are recommending, and so I have reached out to Dr. Eads in the community college system. I look forward to working directly with her on discussing our recommendations for changes to this program and improvement, including looking at the reevaluation of the assessment curriculum and in particular the implementation. And so as you can see, math seems to be working pretty well. It's embedded in the NROC system. It's a series of modules. English, not so much. It's separated from the NROC system, and it's built inside of the English courses. Additionally, we have some longer-term, I've talked to the team about some longer-term data analysis, so we need to get a better handle on who are the students that enroll in this program, what happens to them when they leave their public school. Do they, in fact, enroll in a community college? If they enroll in a community college, do they then enroll in a remedial course, or are they being put into a credit-bearing course? And then what's the outcome of their performance in that credit-bearing course? And so, as you know, we sometimes have some challenges as students transition out of our K-12 and into the community college system, tracking those students. So that's part of what I intend to discuss with Dr. Eads as we continue to try to improve the program. So with that, I will be happy to answer questions or have Dr. Schultz-Royster or Dr. Mullenix.
Yeah, I just want to point out for the board that I think part of the problem here is that the GPA requirements set by the community college are, again, as Dr. Schultz-Royster said, 2.2 to 2.799, unweighted. So that is less than what the UNC system requires. So again, back to this relevancy issue for our students, why would they, we're telling them they have to do this, and yet why would they take it seriously if they can be admitted to a UNC system school?
Yeah, certainly. We had the discussion about we likely are serving the wrong population of students.
That's right.
So this is the first year, and we're learning as we go, and
we will
continue to look carefully.
And part of my conversation with Dr. Eads will be about the kind of requirements in which we place students in this program, including whether or not it ought to be mandatory as opposed to being an opt-in program for students who intend to enroll in a community college.
At one time, I think NROC had a standard of something like 500 on an SAT score. You have to have over that. Is that factoring?
To be in the...
You have to be over
I'd have to look at that criteria list. Do you know?
It was over the national average for SAT score at the time, which is, then you're saying if you're not over the national average, you would have to be in a remedial course, which did not make a lot of sense.
And we did not set we didn't set those criteria.
I know we did, but we ultimately entered an agreement and acceded to those criteria, which I think this board had a lot of reservations about at the time. It sounds like you do too.
Yes, sir. And this predates my overseeing of the division that's overseeing this now. So I am attempting to try to rectify whatever I can.
I'm encouraging you and thanking you for that work.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Very
Just
quickly,
a
Dr.
very quick question. A question about remediation at the community college level. And maybe Dr. Tipton Rogers is the person to answer the question. But I thought that remediation courses were no longer offered at community colleges. That goes back a few years ago.
That's correct. Absolutely.
So then what?
Yes.
That's my question. I mean, these courses in English are frightening.
I agree.
All right, thank
Well,
you.
if I can give a little plug for our capacity here in the agency now to do some of this work through research and evaluation that we haven't had before. So the ability for us to continue to do this work relies on our capacity as a staff too. So I want to thank those folks as well. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. Very quickly, there are a large number of consent items, and I'm going to try and just speed through these. SLA 6 is International Sampled Assessments. DPI needs our approval to notify selected schools that they have been chosen for this year's Teaching and Learning International Survey, and to convey the expectation of participation in support of the U.S. sample. This is an adult-only survey with only national level results. And then we've got 5 more, all of which are reports to the North Carolina General Assembly, so I won't keep repeating that. One is computer science participation in schools. This is an annual report that includes the number of teachers in the field, the courses offered, and the number of students enrolled. SLA 8 is fifth grade career awareness program. We receive this report every year. Local boards are encouraged to implement this program for fifth graders. This report focuses on program activities and student outcomes across the state. SLA 9 is statewide trends in student digital learning access. The state board establishes and maintains a dashboard to publicly display student digital learning data and reports annually on the numbers of devices and connectivity at school and at home. The report also includes key takeaways from the annual survey showing a need for sustainable professional development and more human capacity with regard to technicians and instructional tech facilitators. The survey also showed inconsistent home internet connectivity due to the expense, a lack of dependable service, or a state unavailability of an adequate ISP. SLA 10 covers remote instruction plans and offers a comprehensive overview of the plans submitted to DPI for the 22-23 school year. It encompasses a link to the plans, the number of remote instruction days used, and trends in remote instruction. And then finally, a report on students with disabilities and definition of residence. This is an annual census of all children with disabilities residing in the state. And that closes the student learning initiative.
Thank you, Ms. Kamnitz. We'll now move to the Education, Innovation, and Charter Schools Committee, led by Mr. John Blackburn. Mr. Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I serve as the Chair of Education, Innovation, and Charter Schools with my co-chair, Ms. Jill Kamnitz. We have two action items today on first read. The first one is State Board of Education Policy and Rules update for the schools for the deaf and the blind, and I'd like to call on Ryan Collins.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here with you again. As you all recall, last month this board adopted a new set of admissions policies and procedures for this current school year for the schools for the deaf and the blind, pursuant to legislation that was passed earlier this year. Following that, the Office of General Counsel has gone back and reviewed the policy manual as well as the administrative code to identify any potential inconsistencies with existing policy or procedures. In the course of that, we did identify one policy, ESDB 14, that speaks to placement procedures. We also identified some conflicting provisions of the administrative code, specifically in subchapters 6K, which has to do with the educational services for the deaf and blind more broadly, as well as subchapters 6I and 6J, which deal individually with the schools for the blind and the schools for the deaf, respectively. In consultation with Dr. Derek Jordan, Dr. Lori Morrow, and the directors of the three institutions, they basically have recommended that the board go ahead and repeal all of these policies and administrative codes. Most of the provisions in the administrative code that deal with these schools are either outdated or the statutory authorization for those provisions no longer exists. There have been several statutory revisions to the governance of these schools over time, and just frankly many of these policies and administrative rules are outdated. So the recommendation is that the state board repeal ESDB 14, which is a policy on placement procedures, and that it also initiate the process for repealing subchapters 6I, 6K, 6J, and 6K of Title 16 of the North Carolina Administrative Code on dealing with these schools. Of course, that has to go through the rulemaking process, so that will take some time going through notice and public comment, things of that nature, but the board's approval is the first step in initiating that process. In addition, you will see that there is a formalized policy for the admissions procedures that were approved last week. So the content is what has already been approved. It's just been codified as a formal policy. And finally, there is a provision of the new legislation that requires the state board to identify the geographic coverage areas for the eastern and the north and western schools for the deaf. I have consulted with Michelle Hanley and Mark Davis, who are the directors of those institutions, and confirmed that the existing demographic, the existing county breakdown for each of those coverage areas, currently that is codified in Rule 101 of Subchapter 6J, which is to be repealed. Our office, Office of General Counsel, believes that the requirement that the State Board continue to provide those geographic areas can be accomplished through policy. There's nothing in the law that indicates it has to go through rulemaking. And doing it through policy gives you flexibility in the future should the demographics or the population of the state shift and there needs to be a realignment. So that is the one that is before you for approval. All the others are before you recommended for repeal.
Any questions for Attorney Collins? Thank you, Ryan. EICS2, approval of new State Board of Education policy, funding and accountability for charter schools. House Bill 618 became session law 2023-110 on August 16, 2023. This is an act to convert the Charter Schools Advisory Board into the Charter Schools Review Board, to shift the authority to approve charter schools and charter non-renewal from the State Board to the Review Board, and to create a right of appeal to the State Board of Education from the Review Board decisions. The State Board of Education, State Board, is charged by Article 9, Section 5 of the North Carolina Constitution to supervise and administer the free public school system and the education funds provided for its support, and shall make all needed rules and regulations in relation thereto, subject to laws enacted by the General Assembly. The proposed policy seeks to balance State Board's constitutional and statutory duties to supervise and administer charter schools, which are part of the public school system, and to administer or allocate the funds provided to those schools, with the new duties legislatively provided to the Review Board. I call upon Allison Schaefer, the State Board's General Counsel, to review with us the proposed policy. Allison.
Thank you. Before you have the draft policy for the board's consideration. There's a preamble that sets out that the Constitution of the State of North Carolina, Article 9, Section 5, requires the State Board of Education, or charges the State Board of Education to supervise and administer the free public school system and the education funds provided for its support, and to make all needed rules and regulations in relation thereto, subject to the laws enacted by the General Assembly. The new bill and the new law in Chapter 115C, which is the charter school, and it amends the charter school laws, authorizes the establishment of charter schools, and also changes the governance. The new bill changes the governance, as Mr. Blackburn indicated, from a charter school advisory board to a charter school review board. The new statutory provisions provide that the State Board retains its constitutional authority to establish all rules for the operation and approval of charter schools. However, the law modifies that authority by providing that any rule adopted by the State Board shall be first recommended by the Charter School Review Board. The newly revised statute also retains for the State Board its constitutional authority to allocate funds to charter schools and to ensure accountability from charter schools for school finances and student performance. It designates to the Review Board, it discusses the new Review Board and provides that it is located administratively within the Department of Public Instruction and shall report to the State Board of Education. It is given the following duties. 1, to make recommendations to the State Board on the adoption of rules regarding all aspects of the charter school operation. 2, to review and approve or deny charter applications, renewals, and revocations. 3, to make recommendations to the State Board on actions before the State Board on appeal. And 4, undertake any other duties or responsibilities as assigned by the State Board. In addition, the chair of the Review Board is required to advocate for the recommendations of the Review Board at meetings of the State Board of Education upon the request of the State Board. In order to balance the constitutional requirements of the State Board and the charter with statutory and constitutional duties, and to allocate funds to charter schools and to ensure accountability from charter schools, the board is considering the following policy. One, the request for allocation of funding in new and renewed charter schools, and for material charter schools, those would come before the board for allocation of funding. Specifically, applications approved by the review board would be presented to the state board for allocation of funding before funds are dispersed for that purpose, and also assurance that the application complies with legal requirements. Number two, renewals, again, would come before the state board for allocation of funding, and also with assurances that the charter school is in compliance with the legal requirements imposed on it by law. And number four, material changes that would result in a change in funding would come before the state board for an allocation of funding, again, and assessment of legal requirements. And finally, the supervision and administration of the charter schools, consistent with statutory and constitutional duty to supervise and administer the free public schools, and consistent with its obligations to oversee the operations of the public school entities, and consistent with the board's duty to hold schools accountable for student performance. The state board may request and shall receive regular reports on charter schools' finance, legal compliance, student performance, etc., from the different agencies of the Department of Public Instruction, as well as the review board. That is the policy before the board.
Okay, you've heard summary and our new recommended policy. Are there any questions?
I do, I have a question.
All right, Dr.
Thank you so much, Mr. Blackwell. What I want to do, first of all, is clarify my vote this morning, my second to the state treasurer's motion to withdraw this item from the agenda. So let me talk about that for just a minute. My concern about this policy is that it seems premature. Now, I know we've got to get busy because the law has been passed, and I didn't know the Charter Review Board needs to get busy too. They've got work to do. But I think that we could wait a little while. I think we could wait probably 30 days with a discussion between Chair Davis and Vice Chair Duncan, and perhaps you, Mr. Blackwell, and others, with the leadership of the review board, and say, look, we need to get some things cleared up here. Number one for me is, if we are an appellate body, and I think that's what we're now called in the legislation or something to that effect, what I hope to read in front of me today in terms of this policy is then how do we operate as an appellate board? What does that mean for us? What are the processes that need to be in place for us to hear an appeal coming to us by a charter applicant that was denied by the charter, I keep saying CSAP, but the review board? I want to know that. And I just think that my desire would have been, let's put it off for a little while, give it that 30 days that we always do with the discussion item, and let the leadership from the state board and the new review board get together and talk this through, and then come back next month and do what we need to do. Now, that's my big concern all along, is that, wow, I was going to open this up and read, oh, now we're an appellate board. What does that mean? Let me read my responsibility. How am I supposed to think now as an appellate body with regard to charters that are denied by the review board? The other thing is, my question is this. Okay, so all those things that are outlined in the policy, good work, I mean, drafted well, except my concerns that I've laid out. So does that imply that the state board could withhold funding of the recommendations that are brought to this board by way of information? See, I see maybe the Office of Charter Schools coming to us on a monthly basis or some systematic basis with information about charters that have been approved. And then the financial reports that are in law that they have to bring to us on an annual basis, and the other, like the performance review findings that take place every year on those 3-year, 7-year, 10-year cycles. I know that information will be coming to us through the Office of Charter Schools, but my other deeper question is, does all this mean that, and I understand what the Constitution dictates to us. I am very, very sensitive to my role as a member of the state board as directed by the North Carolina Constitution. But does that mean that we could withhold funding of charters that have been approved by this review board? That's a rhetorical, somewhat rhetorical, maybe it doesn't need an answer. That is the reason I did a second this morning to Treasurer Falwell's motion to withdraw this item. I think that it needs to come off the agenda for that reason, to give it a 30-day pause. It's important, it's huge, folks. This law is huge. And our role, the revision to our role is huge. So I just think of all items that have ever come before this board since I've been on the board since 2013, this one really deserves a discussion, not an action on first read. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oxendine. That was all relevant conversation. It was all well thought out. And we, as a committee, gave that a lot of attention and a lot of thought. And you didn't need to explain your second. I appreciate anybody that wants to make a motion or a second, that's fine. But we felt that the Charter Review Board will start meeting on Friday, and then they'll have some actions next week. So we felt that this was needed to come before us on action on first reading. So, any other comments, Alice?
So my response to that is that this bill passed on June 28th, and this board could have foreseen the fact that it would be overridden by the legislature, and even if we take it to the day that it was overridden, which was August 16th, this the Department of Public Instruction staff did not see this policy until Thursday late afternoon. So there should have been more time for DPI staff to review this. Our CFO had not seen it, the Office of Charter Schools had not seen it. There was ample time for something to get in front of DPI staff.
Thank you for your comments. I'm not sure how we would have known whether it would have been overridden or not, but that's my comment to that.
I got to speak up on this in the same vein. The fact that this has been written, presented to the superintendent on Thursday, major policy that's going to affect changes in how we do business. It was presented to her on Thursday. That was going to be the first question I asked. Didn't get to my office until a few days later, I don't think. The president of the Senate, the lieutenant governor of North Carolina sits on this board, got to me just a few days ago. Inexcusable. And it smacks of political maneuvering is what it smacks of. It's ridiculous. This is a serious policy change. If you wanted to do it, it should have started the moment the bill was passed and been done in that week. And we should have had adequate time to discuss this. We have not had the time to discuss it. We have not had the time to formulate the arguments we need to argue against it. One day of discussion for a policy change. One day. One day. When else has that been done? On something this serious? When else? Somebody go search the record and find it. It's not professional, it's not courteous, and quite frankly, it smacks of almost dishonesty. I'm just going to be plain and saying it. And I know what's going to happen here. Y'all going to listen to what I'm saying. You're going to listen to what Mrs. Oxendine is saying. You're going to listen to what the superintendent's saying. You're going to move forward, and you're going to do what you want. But I can assure you, this will not go unnoticed. The parents of this state are demanding better. They demand better out of this board and better out of us. And quite frankly, we should demand better out of each other. And to do this in one day is unfair. It's unprofessional. And it smacks of political pandering. And it should not be tolerated on an issue this important. Do what you want to do, but you've heard my voice.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Any other comments, questions? Chair Davis?
Yeah, I'm glad to respond. So, yes, the bill passed on August 16th. That's when we knew we had to do work. The very next board meeting since the bill passed is this one. Careful reading of the law was required, and it's a complex issue because the law has many apparent inconsistencies with that. And as soon as our very small, limited staff could put together a draft policy was last Thursday. And this item, more than any other item on our agenda, had a longer discussion before this meeting than any other item. But the reason why I firmly, as a member of this board, believe that the board should continue to focus on our financial accountability stems from the truth that over the last few years, 7 charter schools have closed. At least 5 of them with questionable financial situations, which are currently being reviewed by federal officials, one of which, Bridges Academy, became public yesterday, in which a school was requesting funding for 40% more students than they actually had. We take our funding responsibilities seriously. We aim to work in a collaborative way with the Charter Review Board. Vice Chair Duncan and I have already had conversations with our counterparts on the Charter Review Board and plan to continue to do so as soon as Friday. We intend to work in a collaborative fashion in reviewing the 21 policies that need to be revised, on hearing the concerns that the Review Board has and sharing our own, as well as operationalizing this policy to address many of your concerns, Dr. Oxendine. But because the Review Board plans to start moving forward next week on applications, it's important for us to get this minimum set of policy, which in short says, Review Board, when you approve an application or renewal or something that requires funding, come talk to us about it. It's as simple as that. And it affirms their role in the new governance, affirms our role according to the Constitution, and as stated in the law that created the Review Board. Sure, I would like for us to have a couple of months to discuss this. We didn't get a couple months. We got a couple weeks. And unless we want to tell the Review Board to pause on considering any applications next week to give us a chance to spend 30 days reviewing this policy, I think we need to act now.
Superintendent.
So the board may have spent a couple of weeks doing this, but DPI staff did not. And further, I would say that when we had on Thursday afternoon internal conversations, one question that was asked that is still not answered in this policy is what are the criteria, to Dr. Oxendine's question, what are the criteria that the board could use to not provide funding? Because I will tell you, this board doesn't hear about when LEAs mismanage funds. You hear about it when charter schools mismanage funds. It happens all the time, whether it's deliberate or not. And so I don't see that what a couple of bad actors have done should be a policy that jeopardizes essentially the ability of a charter school to open its doors to the families who've chosen to go there. Because this board, according to the way the policy is written now, because it is so vague, would allow for this board to vote not to open a charter school and not give a reason. And so if this policy contained parameters or a checklist of sorts that would allow for the checks and balances that you may want, that would be a different story. But right now, this policy is so vague that for any reason, this board could deny funding. And as far as the constitutional duty that this board has to supervise and administer funds, as far as I've always seen it, means that you send money to schools per the law, provided they are in compliance. And so if the Charter Review Board has deemed that a school is in compliance, then this board cannot withhold funds. Now, if you want to have a checklist that in the policy that says if these criteria are met, then they shall receive funding, then that's between y'all and the legislature. But I fail to see how the discussions that we've had so far do anything to support children.
I'll respond to that. So each year, the DPI staff brings to us a request to approve allocations to schools. That's when we exercise our funding authority, just as we would under this policy. We take the financial performance of our charter schools and LEAs seriously. And when staff informs us of financial mismanagement or questionable practices in LEAs, we act. We've gone so far as to remove some superintendents in LEAs. So we take seriously our responsibilities, financial and otherwise, with all public schools. And this policy merely provides that same serious responsibility with charter schools. So what judgment will we use in determining funding? The same judgment that we use in determining funding for any school. Is the allocation lawful? Does it meet the need? Are there any other considerations? I mean, essentially, we'll make decisions in accordance with the law. And if there's a situation which comes before us that's, in our judgment, not in conformance with the law, as advised by our counsel, we'll make decisions just as we have before.
Thank you, Chair. Lieutenant Governor.
I'd like to see us not vote on this and have that in writing, because I don't want to give you the power and then wait to see how you're going to use it. If I give you the power, I want to know it's going to be used right. And I want it in writing. I don't want it by word. I want it in writing. I want you to spell it out just like you spelled out this policy. And inside this policy, you're going to write down the criteria that you should follow in this policy. If you don't, it's as if I'm giving you the power and just trusting you to do the right thing.
Dr. Oxenden.
My final comment on this, I just can't, it goes back to my previous comments a few minutes ago. I can't support this policy recommendation, or it's not a recommendation, it's a policy, this action on first read, that now appears to me will come across in a piecemeal fashion. In other words, we got a piece of it today, sometime later, for a variety of reasons, we may feel like, okay, we got to add something else to it. And then 6 months down the road, oh my goodness, we forgot this, we got to add this. And then we have got a cobbled, hot mess, pardon that term, on our hands. And we're talking about the education of children and the rights of parents to have choice. This is problematic for me. The fact that there is a possibility that the Office of Charter Schools can come before us with some recommendations. Some of us may have questions. Now we're finding ourselves going from a few questions to, no, you need to go back to the drawing board and start up. No, folks, that's out of the spirit of the law. I rest my case.
That's exactly right. And that's what happens when you craft hasty policy. Hasty policy that is based on politics oftentimes comes back to bite you in the butt because you have not thought it through completely. Legislation, any type, policy, any type, should be slow and deliberate, and we should put as much thought into it as possible. We've seen it in the past from the federal level on down, and this is just another example of it. What happens if we get down the road and there's questions about this vague policy that we have to answer immediately? It's going to cost us. It's going to cost us problems on this board. So, as I said, you all do what you want to do, but you've heard me.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Vice Chair Duncan.
Thank you for the comments. I would respectfully suggest, as we look at the request for allocation of funding part of the policy, that in each of the sections, it's already in writing that it says with respect to complying with legal requirements, that it's already in writing in the policy. And also specifically references receiving assessments, not just from the review board and the Office of Charter Schools, but also as appropriate, the Office of Financial and Business Services, the Office of Testing and Accountability, Office of Exceptional Children, the Office of Finance of Federal Programs, and other NCPPI divisions as appropriate. I also note that in terms of legal requirements, this sometimes frankly has been a problem with some of the charter schools that run into significant issues. There are important federal requirements that apply to charter schools and the funding of charter schools, and federal funding is involved in that. And there have been issues that have arisen in that connection. So the legal requirements are very important. And we, of course, take seriously as a board the legal requirements that we have under the statutes of North Carolina, but we also must be very careful to comply with the statutes, the federal statutes and regulations that apply here as well, and they have been issues for us. We are working off history in terms of where we are today, and we are, in fact, attempting to take our responsibility under both the statutes, and I think this seeks to reconcile the statutory language and the Constitution. And there are a couple of places where reconciliation is needed from the statute as it was drafted in the legislature. So I think we are trying to do the very things that you suggest are important with this policy, and certainly welcome comments on it. And I would also say, as we go through other policies that already exist that will necessarily need some revision, we do intend to fully work with our colleagues on the Charter Review Board in terms of working through those things. So I just offer those comments as an observation.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Any other comments? Thank you. We will vote on this tomorrow. So the next EICS 3, State Summary of Academic Gains in Restart Schools and Research Study, Learning Loss and Recovery in Restart Schools. We covered this last month. Are there any questions? Ms. Garber's here. Any questions for Julie? Did a great job last month. So thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. This is just a quick update for you. The summary that you had last month did not have any policy recommendations, so you actually do not have any action this month with it. But we just wanted to let you know that in October we will be bringing to you policy recommendations to the DSTR 040 policy along with drafted rules. And then in November we are working with Kaylin Clifton, who you heard from last month, and from the Office of Learning and Recovery to share an analysis with you on the key strategies that are being used successfully in Restart Schools, especially those schools showing growth. So just a quick update for you.
Ms. Garber? Any questions of Ms. Garber? Thank you. Close our report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Blackburn. We'll now take a break and reconvene at 1:30. 1:30.